All right. So I think lots of things are improving with all of these slides. So we are going to talk a little bit more about this kind of intro to complex networks today. The properties stuff, I have to go through a few more properties. I'm going to touch on some models. I'll point to where I've discussed some of the major ones a lot more in principles of complex systems. I was going to show you a couple of things to start with, fun things. So this is a fun thing. This is basically, of course, Google trying to get you to buy this music from them, but it's very nicely done, right? I mean, visualization is this big thing. Some of you are in the data science course, I think, now with Professor Bagro, and this is what we're doing now, right? All this data science business. There's a lot of art that's associated with it. People talk about STEM, but I think it should be STEAM. Put an art in the middle of it. Sounds better too. So it's an interesting time. So you can click on these things, and very nice, right? We can get some. Let's find. Is that Rockabilly? Yep. And then it shows you the albums, right? And of course, you click on the albums, and then you can go and buy them, right? So it's beautifully done in a number of ways, but that's kind of a cool thing. So if we have good visualization, I'll try and show you that. So networks. So here's possibly our largest network, right? This has been talked about, in the past now and then. So there's evidence now that the galaxies are connected through these sort of tendrils of stuff, right? So there's this giant background, crazy background kind of network. And it doesn't seem to be kind of membranes or, like that. It could be like that, right? But it's simply kind of thin, tendrily network stuff, right? This is sort of things at the end of bad movies where it pulls back out and you realize that you're in in someone's, which film was that? You're on the end of, you're actually, this whole world is inside of something else, like Horton, His or Who. What's that?
Oh, is that Men in Black?
Yeah, that's Men in Black. That's it. Good call. Right. Know your popular culture. Very important. Okay, thank you. Okay, so this is an interesting little article. I tweeted it from the course account, so you can go and dig it up. So episodes, for some reason I stayed up till 2 a.m. on Saturday night. Fun person. Making little Perl scripts, do a good job of this. So the episodes now appear like this, and it's a bipartite affiliation graph, people. That's what we've got here, right? So you have the episodes, and then the actual slides, because they don't connect perfectly, right? So these slides, which we're still talking about today, if you click on these guys, it takes you to the episodes, and I'll put in the proper times at some point. Here are our next sets, branching networks and supply networks we're going to get to. Lots of fun there. So that's going to work, and I'll put in the ones from POCs that matter. Okay, look at this. Yes. It's like the basic template. I did manage to do one thing. So there you go. So now it has intros to the lectures, and then it'll be the lecture.
Nice. That's different from last lecture.
Oh, yeah, no, total upgrade. Yeah, look, shadow, look, little drop shadow action.
Yeah, no.
Little graph paper in the background that I stole from somewhere. Probably will get sued for that. Okay, so that's, this is the product we're making.
You're not getting sued, you're doing something wrong.
Yeah. That's a good point. Okay, and so, and I'll fix the POCs, for those of you who've been in POCs, we'll fix that up, and I'll incorporate the relevant slides and episodes in here that are not really missing, but it's a precursor. Okay, so the last thing is that on Thursday, Kathy Bliss, who's a graduate student, she's graduating this year, has done a lot of great work with us on the happiness stuff, networks in general, hidden data, like missing data with network data, very, very difficult problem, right? So if you've got a sparsely sampled network, which is almost all the time, especially for large-scale networks, how do you handle the errors? And that just turns out to be a horrific problem that most people have avoided. 99% of the papers that you see about networks are like, well, we collect this data about a network, and here it is, and then they just pretend that there are no errors, and it's a beautiful network, and you study it. But there's always a missing data problem, and it's pretty horrible. So Gephi is one of the visualization softwares that are out there. We've talked about how looking at networks is a pretty messy business. It doesn't always help. You've got to look at some of the essential aspects that I'll be talking about again today. Clustering and assortativity and so on, and of course the degree distribution, big pieces. But this is a beautiful thing, and it encodes some of the stuff that people have figured out over the last 10, 15 years. So for instance, structure detection. So you see it's an attempt to, whatever network this is, to separate it into its big major components. Right? Those mechanisms, those algorithms are built in. And so it's a little black boxy, which is dangerous, right? This is dangerous. You shouldn't just do this and say, this is the next country we'll invade because of, really bad. So you guys need to know all the background stuff before. Anyway, but Gephi seems to have sort of arisen as the nicest, best, friendliest kind of thing. But there are others, and I've listed a few of them on the website. Several hours were taken up this morning because of this tiny little thing here. This figures I made in 1999. That little bit in there was making all my PDFs barf. I don't know why. I just want to tell you that. God, it's just terrible. It's Adobe. I hate you. I hate you so much. I love you and I hate you. All right. Okay. Yeah. This little bit in here. Who would think? All right. Okay. So you don't want to see the insides. Okay. Clustering. All right. Okay. This is where we got to, and we jumped off because of the time thing. Sadly, lectures have to end. But okay. Mercy comes. Okay, so let's see. So I told you there's two kinds of clustering. This has just been a very valuable little measure. Certainly a constructed one by people trying to find out a way to measure the socialness of networks. Right? So purely branching networks we talked about the other day. None of these, so this node in here, A, none of its friends would know each other. It's just purely branching as you go away. That's not social. Doesn't have a social feel to it. And so we need some way to measure that, right? So, okay, so I'll go through. Hopefully you can. Well, we'll see if you can see this. But all right. What is that screen button? Oh. Why are there these screens? I don't even know what would that be for. You show the previous slide.
You can't even really read that. So
Yeah.
the lights up there.
It was working last week, wasn't it?
It also, when I disconnected everything, stayed on for like 15 minutes. So that's pretty impressively weird. All right, so this is where we are. Okay, here's our tiny network, right? So it's a very small network. This turns out to have a clustering according to this Watts Strogatz model, so Duncan Watts and Steve Strogatz. This is from their famous 1998 paper on small worlds, which again discussed a lot in POCs. So to put it, it's a global average of a local quantity, and the local quantity is the clustering, a measure of clustering for not any of these nodes. They all have their own clustering. The idea is basically what fraction of the possible friendships in your network around you, in your neighborhood, your immediate neighborhood, exist. Right? So you could have 10 friends, and then you have 10 choose 2 ways of those friends being connected. Right? So in general, if you have k friends, you have k choose 2 ways of possible friendships amongst them. You would say it's in some sense very, very social if all your friends know each other, right? But maybe you're tiny little town, or you're in some cult or something, whatever, it's not, might be bad. So again, it's a local measure. So how do you do it? All right, so you look at each person. So this person, if you just have one friend, then we define that to be 0. The clustering is 0. There's no, there are 0 possible pairs around you, but we just sort of a 0 over 0, but we're going to call that 0. So this character C here has 2 friends, and they both know each other. So there's a 1 for that, right? So as far as their little world goes, pure clustering. B sees A and C and D. So in fact, it only sees 1 friendship out of a possible 3. 3 choose 2 is 3. So it's going to get, that's this picture. It's going to get a third, 1/3, right? So 1 friendship out of a possible 3. And from D's point of view, they see a purely social connected world. So they get a 1. So a 0, a 1, a 1, and a third, and we average those and we get 7/12. And everyone gets equal weighting here, right? So the person with few friends is equally weighted as this character. So that that's something you can argue about as being good or bad. This is simply the equation, right? So again, the adjacency matrix, capital A for the adjacency matrix, little a. This means that node Ji connects to node J2, and this is the neighborhood of node I. So we're looking at all pairs in the neighborhood of node I. Of course, I've used Roman here, and now yeah, all right, sorry. Okay, so that's our thing, and then that's for 1 character, and then we average over all of them, divide by n. So that's how we get to our C1. All right, so that's one way to do it. Fine, different notation because we like the brackets. All right, so this is the method introduced by Newman. Other people have talked about it in the past, but this is quite nice too, and you can think about the complexity of calculating this. The first one, you have to have your depends how you store your data. But essentially, your adjacency matrix, then you need to look at all the friends around it, that node, and then look at it if they're connected. So you can make your data storage work better or worse for yourself. For some of these calculations, shortest paths, all these sorts of things, how do you do these well, especially if it's weighted. So we'll come to that later in the course. Okay, so we talk about triples now and triangles. So we're going to have the same little example here. So the triangles in this case, there's one triangle, and it's BCD. And the triples, though, there are many, right? So there's ABC, that's a triple here. So a triple is defined as any, actually it's a path of length 2 in the network, essentially, or the graph. Think of it like that, and it's anchored at the central one. So we don't talk about this triple as being different from this one, unless it's directed, but okay, we're talking about undirected stuff. Okay, so there are triple. So if we go to each node, we have an anchoring here. So there's one triple here, one triple here, one triple, and there are 3 around B, and then A has no triples. So what we talk about here is a inherently kind of global characteristic. How many of these triples are actually closed? So if you go and find a triple and then go and look to see if at that other edge, right? So you go to B and you see it's in this triple. You look at this edge. What's probably that edge exists or not, averaged over the whole thing. All right. So if it's purely social, again, it'll be 1. If it's a purely branching network and there's no closure, you'll get 0. So it's going to get the same one. And so C2 will then be the 3. You have to do this 3 times the number of triangles you find. So you have to count the number of triangles and divide by the total number of triples. You have to count those as well. So you can think of it as closed triples. So there's a 3 because for each triangle we're closing 3 triples, right? There's a triple here, and a triple here, and there. Built out like that. So that's 3 closures. Each triangle gives you 3 closures. In social network analysis, which has existed for longer, bless you and bless all of us, is a transitive triple, you might say. Right? The cynical version is that I hope you're not sick. But it's a very nice thing. Okay, let's see. So here's a little linear algebra. Linear algebra is awesome. Let us use it. We're good. Yeah.
I'm just going to ask, do we not do anything with the SMAs?
Oh, the social network analysis is just this is the term they use. This is
that's their
exists in sociology, and it's sort of a framing of
Okay.
Yeah. There's a whole literature. I'm just pointing to what another literature would refer to this as.
Okay. That's all of the definition that you were bypassing.
It's just another, you might see the term in a different way. Yeah, triadic closure. It's another great just to move it away from actual human kind of, people kind of speak. Let's see. So it sounds like you're doing something very, very impressive. Okay, so, all right. So here's a fun thing to do with adjacency matrices, right? If we're talking about, this is for C2. So if we have a path between IK and J, then a very simple thing is that AIK, AKJ has to equal 1 because there has to be a connection between I and K, and that means a 1. Again, this is undirected, unweighted networks, right? There's a 1 or a 0 in the 1. And you can think about what you would do for weighted ones and directed ones. That's the problem. Okay. What does degree distribution mean? And there are another 6 dimensions. Okay, so this is true, right? If one of these edges doesn't exist, or both of them don't exist, then it's 0 times 0, or 0 times 1, or 1 times 0. So this would be 0. So this is a sneaky way of encoding the fact that there is this triple. All right, okay, that's true. And so, and in general, that has to be true if you have a path between, so if you travel through a bunch of nodes, from one node I to J, and you travel along a bunch of links, and you travel very specifically from node I to node K1, I guess the notation is funny, but K1 to K2, K2 to K3, and so on, then it exists only if this product is 1, right? You just have to have all of those guys on. It's a little math way of saying it. But this is actually really one part of the product of the matrix A times the matrix A times the matrix A times the matrix A. Right, so A, right, so in general, A times B, right, the ijth entry of that guy, you guys love this stuff. AK, B, KJ. And it'll be the sum from, and let's say these are square, right? M by N. M by N, it's from K equals 1 to N, right? So it's the ith row times the jth column, right? The dot product of those guys. Yeah, almost. All right, so if you think about this, the ij entry in here, it's going to get a 1 every time there's a triple involving I, and K, and J. Right? And if there's not a path between them, so if I has these 3 paths connecting it to J, 1, 2, 3, right? Then this will be a 3. You get a 3 in this product. If this is, now we're going to go back to A squared, right? So A squared. This will have a 3 in the ijth entry. Yeah, my line? No. Good to know all about networks, right? Obama just had a speech saying that they're going to move back from 3 steps away from known terrorists to 2, which is, you think, wow, those big numbers. It's true. 3 is a big different, it's very different from 2. But if you know about the small world stuff, right, 3 is basically the whole planet. It's really a long way out. So, but it seems really small. It's a very small number. 1, 2, 3, very small. Anyway, all right. So just saying, it's all over the place. Sorry, irrelevant. So, okay, so that's true. So let's see. So this is a little aside here, and then this is what's going on here. So if we sum up, so we take the ijth entry, and then we sum over all possible i's and all possible j's, then we've got all the triples. But we've counted them twice, so we're going to divide by 2 because we've gone ikj and jki. We've counted them. We've gone both ways. This is really about paths. And we have to get rid of the ones that hop out to themselves and come back. Right. So this isn't a triple. If this is I and K and this guy equals J equals I. Right.
What happens if it's a directed graph?
Okay, so directed graph, then you have to think about what you mean by clustering, but the paths it counts paths very nicely, actually. It does the same thing. So that entry will be the number of paths that go from I to J, depending that you...
No, I meant in the directed graph, can I and J be equal as part of calculated clustering?
So yeah, that wouldn't happen, right, you wouldn't get that. No. Unless you have a mixed thing that allows, unless you allow, okay, it's possible, right? But then the way that graph will look is like this, I and K, and it will have an extra, it will have an edge that does that.
But would you count that as a triangle?
No.
Okay.
Right, okay, so, no. Yeah. Yeah. Because your friend's friend is you. Yeah. The Obama thing, by the way, co-edited. No, it was actually John Stewart. Yeah. The whole getting confused with your friends of your friends of your friends. Like, that's okay, but not the friends of your friends of your friends of your friends. Okay. All right, so this is pretty good. This is the number of triples, so that's kind of fun. Right? Square A, so you can just put that into something, square it. This is a sum of everything, a norm of some sort, and then you can take the trace of A squared because it's counting all of the ones that hopped out and came back to themselves. Cool. Number of triangles, if you think about that, is a 6th of the trace of A cubed. Because this is nice. So, how's that? This is just a little bit of fun. Okay, so because now, okay, so we're going to go hop, hop, hop. Right. That's a triangle. And you can't come back to, you don't have this problem, you don't have to worry about this little problem where you've come back to yourself. And you don't have to worry about this guy doesn't count because you can't get back to yourself like that, right? Right, so you don't get that. So if you were doing 4 cycles, then that could be messy. If you wanted really distinct 4 cycles, then you'd have to worry about this. So this is counting, because of this path story, it's counting this hop, 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 hop. And you want, so now you've got this kind of entry, AJ, AJK, AKI. So this is 1 if there is a path from I to J, and then J to K, and then K to I. 0 otherwise. And then we sum over all of them, K, and then beautifully, this is the trace of AQ. Right? So this is the trace of AQ. And we could have started here, here, or here, and we could have gone either way. So we have to divide by 6. We've counted by 6. That's kind of nice, right? I mean, there's all sorts of other things we can do. But it gives you a sense of how hard it is to count those things, right? There's an AQ kind of floating around.
When you say like we could have gone either way, does that mean that this is direct?
No, so it's purely undirected. It just means that we could have our little hop excursion around on our network, which doesn't have any directions. When we use this calculator to find out how many paths there are between I and itself, if we take 3 hops, we could go boom, 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 all this way.
Okay.
Yeah. And we're just worried about, yeah.
I don't remember exactly. So trace was the sum of the diagonal?
Yeah, sorry. Trace is the sum of the diagonals. Yes, exactly. Right. It's the sum of the diagonals. So in this case, you can see there's a J, this guy, and this guy. So that's forming the product of A times A times A. And then, because we're summing over the, right, this piece here is A times A times A, and it's actually the ith entry of that. If we take this sum, let's put this sum out here, like this. Yeah. Sorry, so I want this guy. Right. All of this is the ith entry. If these were different, then it's just the IL entry of that product AQ. But because we wanted it to come back to itself, that's nice until there's a trace. Trace is a lovely thing. Traces appear in all sorts of places. They seem kind of benign little guys, but like kind of why would you add up the diagonal? But it turns out to have all sorts of fun properties with eigenvalue and so on. Madness, right? Okay, good. Someone was saying how defending math the other day, saying it's beautiful and logical. Well, it is logical, but it's full of ugly, crazy, terrible things as well, right? And it ends up that someone explains to you that, no, you had to hop over that log, and then you have to run along the river, and then you kind of paddle. And if you don't, you get eaten by crocodiles, right? And it's because 4,000 monks tried that, And so there's some stuff that, that all makes sense, but there's a lot of stuff that only makes sense after someone has shown you this ridiculous route, which is all logical, but at every point it's like, well, I could just, no, don't do that. You'll go mad. What you really want is, and we want this in science, I think, is you have a long corridor of truth or whatever it is, and then there are doors all along it that say, never go in here. I know you want to, which of course makes you want to go in, because and then it has another door inside that says, no, really, which was put in there by the person who went in the first one. Okay, all right, excursions. Okay, so so a few things. So the first guy tends to discount the fairly connected ones because everyone just gets 1 vote in this clustering measure. C2 is often a little preferred because it's you can do this kind of nice stuff on your algebra. They're not always the same. C1 is equal to 0. C2 is, so that they trend in the same way. So I've talked about these things. All right, fine. Okay, clustering, big deal. Okay, so motifs, something we might come to again. But basically, this was a nice advance at some point. We've had the whole degree distribution. We had clustering, sortativity was being talked about, which we've mentioned as well. That there are little structures within these networks, because of course we're thinking about huge networks, but this point was made, Thierry Alon and his team coming out of Israel, that, and this is thinking about gene and gene-protein networks, that's the root of it, but thinking about lots of other networks eventually, that they might have recurring little substructures, and that they may have some reason for being. And when we look at random networks in general, generalized random networks, we'll explore the way that you would find these kinds of structures out. Okay, so one thing that was noticed early on, for example, was that compared to, so if you fix the degree distribution of a network, and then you randomize it, And then you make a bazillion copies of that, right? So you fix the, if this guy has 10 friends, then in this network it has 10 friends. But otherwise it's been randomized. And we'll talk about how to do that properly. And it turns out to be tricky. But basically, this is a nice thing. You create an ensemble of comparative networks, right? You don't care how this thing was grown. It's just like it exists. This is the gene network for some thing, maybe a human or whatever, right? And it's like, this is the way it works. So how do we start to scrutinize that thing? And so one idea is, well, okay, this guy interacts with 30 people, and this one acts with 30 things, whatever it is. And this one acts with 2. Okay, that's fine. So let's take it over here, and then we're going to scramble all the links. And then we're going to look to see if, apart from the degree distribution, which we've fixed, is there anything else that's kind of different about the real one from these randomized versions? And so you have a statistical comparison. So one of the things that popped out, and there are a couple of other major ones, was a so-called feed-forward loop. So X is promoting Y, and it takes a little while to ramp up, and then Y promotes Z, and that starts to turn on, or Z, depending on where you're from. And then X has to be involved as well, right? So this is a delay in turning on, but if X stops promoting, then Z stops straight away. So it has a slow turn on, so this is a way of making a switch have different timescales. Very smart, right? Of course, found by mindless, evolution producing things, right? So the analogy is to elevators, right? So you want them to open straight away as soon as you put your hand in, but then delay in the other way. Okay. So you find these sort of structures appear. Natural, they appear much more than you would expect from a random network. So this gives you some insight into what's going on in your network that you need to start explaining. That's horrible. So this is Klaus Ed. So he's done a lot of interesting things, a lot of different fields. This is one of many, this is a vast array of work on this problem of structure detection, right? So someone feeds in some network data and wants to split it apart into, and you want to say, well, does it have like 2 big pieces, or is it just one big blob, or does it have 7 pieces? How do you do that in a reasonable way? How do you do it without saying, I think there are 7? How do you get the machine to do it, right? So lots of competing ideas, incredibly well-cited, cite themselves like crazy. This is a big deal. And it makes sense, right? You've got this horribly big, messy data set, and you want to find its structure. This is the big story. We went from motifs, which are tiny things. This is the big, gross structure. So this is a NCAA football. So the data that's fed in here is these 2 teams interacted, meaning they played a game, right, over some time, and the conferences and so on pop out. So this is a verification thing. Like people know which conferences these teams are in, and the algorithm spits out which it thinks this is a group, so they'll get a triangle. These are a little more mixed up, and it matches with what's actually been set out in the real world. Okay, so that's one example, but there are many, many different kinds of examples there. That's huge. We'll come to that later on in the course. It's absolutely ridiculously big. Really, really crazy. Yeah. So lots of clever ideas, lots of competing ideas. Concurrency, very simple thing. Okay. So this is, oh my gosh, this has been around for a long time. I mean, there's papers back in 1996 talking about this, but of course, forever. It's just simply that, and we had this with that high school kissing network, right? It matters the order of things, right? So this is, again, one of these stories where people just simply kind of made networks and looked at them, and one thing to do is accumulate your data. I've got all these interactions. This one occurred 3 years ago, but I'm just going to put it in my network. Right? And this one occurred 2 years ago, and just make it. It's easy to do, a bit of a problem. So, okay, so I'm just saying all these things. This is fine, so don't be careful. This is a nice piece of work by Martina Morris and Krishmar back in '96 saying we've got to do this. And so, it's funny to see that now we have 2013, 2014, we have the stat mech physicists getting very excited about this new thing, temporal networks, and solving all sorts of nice math problems associated with things that happen sequentially. But of course, we knew about that. All right. Okay, I have another one of these guys. Let's see if it explodes or not. We saw some of these the other day. This is just a little breather in here. This is starting from Greece. So if you didn't see the other day, this is a disease starting in Greece and then being transferred out over. So that's pretty bad. That was bad for everyone. Okay, good. over the airline networks. Yeah.
What was the disease in Greece?
No, this is a made-up one.
Oh.
Yeah, this is all made up.
Ask that last one
Democracy. That's what it is.
too. Good answer.
All right, this one slide cost me 2 hours this morning. Okay, so right, so this is something we're going to talk about next, and it's the first big part of the course. Branching networks are absolutely beautiful things. They're everywhere. They're sitting inside you right now, doing a good thing, keeping you alive. And they have come into being to solve problems of supply and collection. Right, you have the material structure, sending out the good stuff. You sneak it through your little blood cells through some capillaries or capillaries, depending on what. I actually had a student once who visibly winced when I said the wrong thing, by their estimation. Anyway, so and then it's brought back by the venal system, all right, which they have different properties, but and it's not all purely branching. There's a circle of Willis, which is all sorts of things. But right, so we're in it, and we have all sorts of other river networks. Of course, are the big global scale kind of picture as well. Okay, so we'll understand. This is really where fractals. The first time people quantified fractals, actually, turned into it. Didn't call it that word, right? That's Mandelbrot much later on. But it's work by Horton, and I'll explain these things when we get to them. But essentially, yeah, there's a way of categorizing streams. So these are little guys, and then if you trim off the little dash ones, you get these guys. There's some reason for doing this. These thinner ones, we call them order 2. We call these little ones order 1. This is order 3. And then you start to think about, well, what's the typical length of these guys? What's the typical area that they service, if it's blood, for instance, or drain, if it's a network, a drainage network, that sort of thing. And then look at how those things go from scale to scale, and they have this nice scaling property. We know all about parallel size distributions, right? So that turns out that if you pick a point on the landscape and look at how big the length of the stream is, if you like, if you put a little raindrop there and let it trickle down, and or looked at the area so if maybe you pick this point and you find this drainage area, then you get a parallel size distribution, which of course you do, right? All right, so we'll talk about that too. Okay, a couple of other little bits and pieces in here. So network distances, this matters. So shortest path lengths, we love these things. We can handle them when they're, this sort of thing feeds into, for instance, the structure detection stuff, right? In a funny way, but it's a very essential kind of measure. Whether, of course, the network functions in this way by using shortest paths, that's another issue, especially, say, social networks. But it's a very important thing. So simply the fewest number of steps, and if it's weighted, then it's going to be a different thing, right? It's going to take a certain kind of path. Electrical networks are very different, right? There's a random diffusion that's going on. To think about that, sometimes you see chemical distance. So that's very simple, and then you can take the average of this, right? And this is a big part of that first Small World paper, the 1998 paper. Just take the average across all pairs in the whole network, and that gives you some idea, right? I mean, let me say this too. So the biggest pieces to start with are the number of nodes and the number of edges, right? Let's say in an undirected, unweighted network. They're the biggest piece. Like if you want to compare a network to another network, you've really got to be very careful unless you have those things in place, right? The number of edges changes things so much. The number of nodes potentially changes things so much. So they're the big elephants in the room that you could forget about. But that's important. Right, so the average path length of this network versus this network, I mean, is it apples to oranges? It's okay if they have the same number of nodes, same number of edges. That's good. Clever ways of figuring these things out. We'll get to that again if it's, as I said, if it's weighted. That's cool too. We can deal with that. Very clever things. Computer scientists worried about this for different reasons, and operations research people worried about this kind of thing. So that's been solved a while back. But smarter, clever algorithms come along. Okay. One other thing is a little more fragile, but network diameter, which is simply the maximum of the shortest path lengths, it gives you some idea of the extent of it. So that's something you might measure, and again appears in some of the classic papers. Closeness is not a bad thing because it's a bit funny, but basically you take 1 over the shortest path length between pairs of nodes, average all of those, and then divide by the number of possible pairs, right? Okay, and the number of pairs, right? So that's n choose 2. That's the number of paths that you're summing over. So that gives you somewhat a normalized thing. It's a bit funny, and then you invert it again. So it's got, if this was in meters, then it's 1/meters and then meters again. So it is a distance measure. That's okay. The sneaky idea here is that if you have a network that you care about, and you care about thinking, and it's separated, right? It's got some disjoint pieces to it. So in a sense, the shortest path between a node here and a node here, if they're in separate clusters, is infinity. Then it can handle that, right? Because it'll just put a 0 here. 1/infinity, you just put a 0 here. So it's a sneaky way of dealing with that. The only time you would get, in fact, infinity for this is if they're all disjoint, right? There are no links at all. So it allows you to compare. Again, it's a comparison tool. I don't know what it means to say the average closeness distance is 7 for a network, but if you're comparing this network to this network, they have the same number of nodes and edges. This one is twice, right? So it's a way of handling it. It's a way of handling it. Average path length when networks have broken up clusters. Okay, that's what that's for. All right, so I've said these things there on the slides. All right. Okay, this is important. Again, it will be important for centrality. Will be important for structure detection stuff. Right? How do you break things up? How do you see if there are these big structures? So there are lots of these, and the idea is to measure. It's a very human, anthropomorphic, thing, and I talk about this in other areas like fame and so on. Ideal, right? We want to find the important characters in a thing, whether they be terrorists or people we want to market to, or lots of good and bad reasons for doing this. What's that?
Or both.
Which ones?
I don't know.
I didn't know.
Maybe you want to market terrorists.
Oh yeah. You can do it all. Right, that's good. Yeah.
It's like doing a service. You're taking the money.
Yeah.
That's right. Put them in debt. Yeah. Fans of the Discworld will appreciate that. You should look up the anthem of Uncle Morpork, which is we own all of your weapons.
Okay.
We own all of your stuff. So, the second verse is no. It's actually written like that because no one ever knows the second verse of their national anthem. So it's just made more straightforwardly. La 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 or something like that. Okay, sorry. So I think it could, right, okay, we've hit on a point. All right, so, okay, but you want to find important, it's like what's the most important thing? And, so you've got some big power system, say the US, take out this generator, does it all explode? This is you can see the motivation for doing this. But it's going to be a much more complicated thing where you need to find the 70 most important ones or the 30, how do you do that? Combinatorial disaster. Right? So there's a bit of a human bias involved here, especially with the first one, which is degree centrality. Reasonable thing to start with, but it's, which node has the most friends, right? Okay, so then you've got, someone in the middle of a cult or something. So from a global they matter over here, but they don't matter, in the whole thing. So we move, so that's okay to start, and then we start to think about things like betweenness, which is, so you see these things are building, so there's the shortest paths. We take something that we could kind of compute, we sort of have lying around, it's not perfect. As I said, social networks don't necessarily use shortest paths or whatever it is, ants and their networks, whatever network we have. But the idea is, and we'll look at how to compute this later on, you simply take all the shortest paths, look at them all at once, and then whenever a shortest path crosses a node, you put a bean there, right? And so you count the number of beans at each node. So you overlay all these shortest paths. So if you have, the simple, so you're going to pick up these characters, for example. Right, so say you have two big communities and there's a bridge character here. Then betweenness, all these shortest paths, every time you take a node here and a node here, even though they might not be really functional paths, but this calculation will give them a huge betweenness. And that's true. I mean, so if you take them out, if they are not working, then you've found a reasonable thing, right? So that's not bad. You can do it for edges as well. So it's simply which edges matter the most, and so you can see this matters, of course, for the George Washington Bridge, right, which we've had fun with recently. Right. Great network problem. We were pushed on a little bit by
Like Glenn was something.
certain connections. What's that?
The bridge was like shut down for days.
George Washington Bridge. Christie, a little bit of a scandal. New Jersey. You are from New Jersey.
No, but I don't listen to anything he says.
No, it's not. Well, other people have been talking about this.
Yeah.
They just bought Lee, a little bit of trouble. Let's make sure our friend Lee is having some trouble. Actually, they didn't. So that's the thing. They didn't say it like you would in classic New Jersey sort of stuff. They were just very explicit. Port Lee should have some trouble now. Like, oh, I'm on it. You know, it's like, it should be much more cryptic.
So they basically shut down the GW.
Pretty much, yeah.
That's not.
Yeah, because you can set up the lanes, right? So you know, so you can say these
Wow,
lanes are
that's
going in,
awful.
or this. Yeah, it was like 4 days where it was gridlock, a disaster. And there are actually like humans trying to get to places, sometimes very serious reasons, like school, which is a start, and then there's hospital because you're dying. So there's, yeah.
They're already angry on the morning commute, so.
Yeah, no.
Oh, commuting is one of. If you list, I mean, it's a first world problem. But if you list, well, no, I mean, it's a problem across the world. Like getting from one place to another is just an awful thing. It just sucks, So. Unless you've got your own helicopter. Yeah, I mean, generally speaking, people don't like commuting. They complain about it a lot. That said, the U.S. has managed to produce a few people who commute 5 hours each way. There are a couple. The super commuting people. It's worth looking up. Some of them are, they work in New York City and live out the back of Philadelphia or somewhere, or like out in Pennsylvania, and have to take boats and yaks and all sorts of things. Lots of reading. Anyway, all right, so commuting, very bad. Okay, so, it has a high between us, right? Yeah, so if you knew, that's a bad place to mess with.
So the interesting thing about betweenness is that the middle node should have a slightly lower betweenness than the ones right next to it. No, should they? Or should it be the same as the two adjacent to it?
There'll be a tiny difference because of, there's the shortest path between these two and these two. Yeah.
Okay.
But it's basically going to be the same. So in this case, these ones, if this was like this, then it's clearer that that person's the one. Yeah. But if you have a string of nodes, then it's much more fragile as well. Yeah. Yep. Another measure of importance, hubs and authorities, right? Also page rank, which I didn't explicitly say because I'm kind of referring to it implicitly. So John Kleinberg, a smart person at Cornell, MacArthur genius, one of these sort of characters, came up with this at IBM, and they said, well, Indiana Jones style, they put it in a box and put it out the back. But it's the idea that some nodes, so this thing about the web, will be authorities. They have information. And some will be hubs. They point to places with information. And of course, there's some blending between. So a Wikipedia page is a good example, right? There's authority on it, and then there's a hubness, which is the pointing out to other places. So, and then this is a recursive idea, right? So the idea is that good hubs and good authorities point to other good hubs and good authorities, and that continues out. So if your good score contributes, so if you're a node with a good authority, you should be pointed to by hubs that have good scores for hubness. So it's a recursive thing, linear algebra, very nice. And that's another more, so these ways, as soon as you get out past this one, you're starting to include the whole network. You're trying to calculate things. There's a global computations, right? And it moves away from our sort of individual human point of view. Okay, very good. So that's a set of properties and features, and I've just touched on a few, I guess. Could add some more, but that's pretty good. Let me just zip through these guys. We don't really need to go over this, actually, because, as I've said, so generalized random networks, we'll dig into these later on. These are going to be great fun. Scale-free networks we've talked about. Small world networks we've talked about. These guys we have mentioned very much in passing. They are beloved of social network analysis, but they don't give you, I'm going to say, they're generative, but they're not generative in a mechanistic, physical way. Right? Here's a microscopic model for why it becomes this. It's a way of creating a box of networks that look kind of like that, which is okay a little bit, but not too much. Basically, black boxes with funny dials on the side, and you're not sure what's going on. Yeah. Glyphs written on there. Generalized affiliation networks, well, we've really talked about those two. So I think I'm just going to leave this up here and sort of zip through this a little bit. Yeah. So we'll get to these, but basically, beautiful area to play around with, and it's bordering on reality. Very dangerous situation, right? So pure random networks, not so good, but they have some nice features like phase transitions and all sorts of things. This one is, now we're getting closer, right? This is the motif stuff, for example, is connected to this. So we're allowed to specify any degree distribution we want, and then we have to randomly wire things together. And that turns out to be an interesting problem. Scale-free networks, talked a lot about this. This is the rich gets richer scheme, hugely embedded in all sorts of real networks. And all sorts of other real phenomena, discovered over and over again by others. This was, this particular kind of network was introduced by Barbaros and Albert, but DeSole Price had a paper in the 70s or 60s in Science about citation networks using Simon's model. It's the same kind of story. Okay, but you guys have seen this. Okay, so just to touch on it, small world networks, we have these guys. So these are the two big stories, right? So small world networks are local structures, so they have good clustering locally, so they feel social even though this is completely made up. And you add a few random links on top, and you get this property of smallness. Right? The average path length drops tremendously. We dealt with the problem that, in fact, you can't navigate around on these things. So again, Kleinberg was involved here. Some of his work and some of our work dealt with this issue of figuring out how to construct networks that are real-ish or inspired by reality and have a navigability aspect to them. That's this piece. Let me just throw it up again. We're going to do this properly later on, bipartite affiliation networks. There's beautiful stuff here for the random version. Very natural, very reasonable. So individuals are here, and these are contexts, for example. So this is true. We're sitting in a classroom right now. Maybe you have sports that you play, or a place where you live, and so on. So there are all sorts of contexts that people move in and out of, and that induces networks, right? So A and B are connected through context one, and so on. We got a little bit carried away for a while thinking about we just want to be able to produce these networks or play around with them arbitrarily. But they really, in many cases, they are manifested out of this bipartite structure. So unipartite, bipartite. These are the funny words. All right. A couple of examples, right? So boards and directors, movies and actors. Okay, cool. And you can go on with these things. You guys have seen this. If you've seen POCs, you can start to think about these contexts that, say, in this case for people, that they move in, that they have some structure, right? This is occupation, more and more refined as you go down. So this gives you a sense that these guys are more connected to each other, E&D, because they're in healthcare, than, say, someone who's out in education, broadly speaking. Okay, all right, let me say for everyone. So then you have these overlapping kinds of identities and or elements of identity, and they have different features to them. So this might be age, for example, might have this kind of structure. There's a huge amount of unexplored stuff here, but it goes back in the sociology literature and in common sense, in a sense, way back, many years. People talking about these circles that people move in, and so then you have something like Google Circles, which is a manifestation of this exactly. And they're exactly trying to create this thing that really exists in the real world. Okay, so nutshell. Good. As I said, many of those things were discussed in much more detail in POCs, and the pieces that we'll get into later. So we have the late 1990s. This whole thing takes off. Its data is the big deal, because these networks always existed, and they underpin many of these systems we think about. Complex systems had been around, but it hadn't really, it had taken off, but this really made it take off. And we're interested in these kinds of networks, large scale. They don't have to be, of course, but sparse. They're natural or man-made. They might be, all sorts of origins. Certainly, evolving and dynamic. These are hard things we're getting at still now. As I said, temporal networks is a thing now, and they have, this encodes as well the network evolving and things evolving on top of it. Right, so contagion processes running on top of it. For example. All sorts of things, and how the network evolves over time. Mention 3, this kind of very crude taxonomy. There are physical type ones where there's really a link. There are interactional ones where the links are a little more ephemeral. or carried out in some sort of space where they disappear, perhaps, and abstract, truly abstract. We have graph theory, but we're moving into thinking about where these networks come from. That's what we want to understand, how they evolve, how they change, and that's much more of a physics kind of approach. We really care about where things come from. It's an approach of most of science, right? Pure mathematics is fine. They don't have to worry about this. It just exists. There's a giant book, and you're just uncovering truths that are just in there that God made, and that's your job, right? Describe and explain. This is basically science, right? And to the extent we can, this is very hard. The description thing, very, very hard. As I said, still going, huge battle. And we care about explanation. Google doesn't necessarily, or Walmart doesn't necessarily. They can figure out what to sell you based on massive amounts of correlations. And Amazon, they don't care why people buy 50 Shades of Grey or whatever it is. It's just in their matrix, right? It's like, okay, let's front that to people. What's that?
Pop-tarts.
Pop-tarts.
Yes.
Yes, Pop-tarts for potential hurricane victims. Thank you, Walmart. Okay. So yeah, which creates a whole rich gets richer thing as well, right? That's also in all of those mechanisms, that you're fronting this thing that other people like, and we're making it very easy to see what other people like. So you buy those things, and that reinforces it. So years ago we talked about with this search problem that you really need to create something, and there have been some efforts to do this, but it's hard. Like, you're searching for something, and you want something down the, maybe associated with it says, here are some opposite point of views, or here's something that's completely different, but what's different is vast. But you can imagine something to help us a little bit with that, because your search can become very stuck. And that keeps coming up when people talk about canalization, and the filter bubble was a framing that appeared in the last few years, but this problem's been around for a while. All right, so we understand a bunch of things, as I've said, just quickly here, clustering and so on, assortativity, degree distribution being the big deal, and there's still a lot to do. Very exciting. Okay, cool. All right, so there are your references, all right, if you want to dig into some more goodness there. And we're actually going to start, and I know we had a little delay on that first day, we're going to start talking about branching networks. If I click on the right one, yes. Cool. Okay. So we're going to start with the kind of physical thing, right? The branching networks, and then we'll move to supply networks, which is, how do you get stuff from one place to another if you're doing that with lots of places and lots of stuff, right? But branching networks are, in principle, a little simpler to start with, one would think. Right. Okay. The people who are kind of cold, they're room temperature organisms, I have to say. But this one is usually doing something funny when someone comes home. But today it's all wrapped up in a blanket. He, I should say. For some reason it's a he. Okay, Sealy. Clever names. Sealy and Lamb. Call a thing what it is, right? It's a spade. Okay. Okay, so we're going to do all these things. There are two parts to this lecture set. There's going to be just sort of a description part. I'm going to tell you, what's going on with these networks. Are they just a big mess, or do they have some universal structure? As I've kind of imparted, we're going to get to this fractalness. Still, I will say, and then we'll go into some of the explanations of how these things connect with each other, how these descriptions connect with each other. The descriptions we have here work for river networks and blood networks, which is branch. There's two big examples. They, in terms of this micro to macro story, this is still an unsolved problem. And there are lots of people who have come up with ways for why river networks might form, and we'll see a nice video maybe today, which is a beautiful thing. It's such a beautiful thing that it was never published, and because it looks so good, but one didn't really have a good explanation for it. Okay, it's by a couple of people in. I'll come to them. Magnasko, who's at Rockefeller, and Bruce Shaw, who's at Columbia. Okay, so as I've said, these sorts of things, right? So supply and collection, right? We think about the arterial and the venal networks. River networks is a great example. So supply, and it's 2D or 3D. We're typically thinking about this, right? 4D is too much for our brains to handle, and 1D is too easy. Okay. So we have networks inside us that they're 3D things, and they're certainly mirrors of each other, or reflections of each other. We're either supplying, where we're trying to get from an origin out to many things. So it's a point to many points in space. So you've got a dimensional problem. You can think of cities, right? You're trying to get all these cars and people and trains and so on in, and then get them out. And how does that scale, right? That's a good problem. So okay, and you often see emerging naturally and through human kind of accidents and so on over time, hierarchical, this fractal, self-similar kind of things. All right. So lots of examples. I mean, obviously, you can look at trees and wonder about trees. Trees are a little hard to measure, right? You need to take a picture of it and then turn that tree into a 3D thing that you can then analyze. Years ago, we talked about making tree butts, like little things that could run around. Bongo should do this. Run around a tree and track where it is, and then you get your tree picture. For these things, people are very cunning, and they've done all sorts of things to organisms like rats and so on. So, for instance, you can replace the rat's blood with some kind of plastic, and then remove the rat. And then you have your structure, normal rat. There's simply getting it all out and kind of counting, looking at lengths and so on. That's messy.
Turnip mounds and the pouring of molten aluminum.
There you go. Yeah. Also not good for the termites, but you get a nice structure, right? Yeah.
It feels much nicer than
That's better than
plastic.
termites. Yeah, right. And that works?
Oh yeah.
Oh,
Those are
cool.
Big, beautiful, huge networks.
Yeah.
Like
And you
mounds
remove the whole thing.
and
And you said pouring in what?
molten aluminum.
And that doesn't destroy the... Wow, that's
You
cool.
should see it. You should
Wash
be
it.
like,
Okay, so we'll totally put that in as a video. That's cool.
It's really
That's a good
and
good
they're selling
movie.
it as art, right? Yeah, they're making tons of these structures and stuff.
I mean, evolutionary trees, right? So it's a branching story there. Yeah. A little bit of funny things can happen, but very basically branching. Organizations are sort of thought to be, right, we think of them as nice hierarchies and so on, which they aren't. I mean, they never are. The military isn't. I mean, much of we talk about it like that. It's a lot of cross connections, and we'll have a piece of that towards the end of the semester, where you see how fundamentally important, of course, those connections are, right? They take purely hierarchical structures are brittle, right? They don't have a resilience. If you take out the trunk of something, then it's in trouble. And we kind of have some structure here that stops us from losing our main pipes, right? We're in a lot of trouble if that happens. If you look at a leaf is a different thing. If you take out the middle piece of a leaf, then it actually will still function, depending on the leaf. But there are lots of little connections. This isn't a purely branching structure. All right, so these things are everywhere. This is the Amazon. So actually, part of my PhD was the geometry of river networks. Was the title. So I was using geometry in its ancient and most obsolete way, measuring the Earth, right? But we somehow lost the Earth. And the Earth generally isn't triangles and squares, right? It's as Mandelbrot with that. It definitely is this fractal story. So yeah, I had data, and it was a mile resolution or a kilometer resolution for the U.S., for Africa, so I had the Nile, for example, Congo, right? Mississippi. I'll show you some of that. But fun problem. You have this topography, and then you imagine dropping little bits of rain on it, and then letting that trickle down, and that traces out your networks, right? So I had all sorts of things because you run into lakes and nasty little ponds, so you have to backfill those guys. I had a algorithm called Kevin Lake Waster. Dot Perl or something. No, it was a C program. Anyway, so we'll get to that. This is a very nice, beautiful area of work, and you can see, I mean, it has this self-similarity. So trees. This is an excellent Australian gum tree. Fine tree. Okay, apple box. Okay, so let's finish today, and I'll show you a little bit of this. Yes, connection. So this is kind of great because. Can I pause this? Okay, so I was handed a VHS. This is a long time ago, people. VHS, with something scrawled on the side saying, we've done these simulations. Here's some output from it. Right? I mean, can you imagine a computer and you have to put it onto VHS? Yeah, right. This is a long time before YouTube, right? It's now on YouTube because what happened was they distributed a couple of these, and I was interested. And then I think it was Marcello's computer, or Marcello, his computer exploded, and everything's lost. Everything's lost. No backup disaster, right? So it's all gone. And there were just these sort of surviving videotapes, which I popped up with several years later and said, oh, I still have your thing. So I digitized it and sent back the original, but this is sort of all that remains of this really beautiful work. So these guys both went through Leo Kadanoff. They worked with Leo Kadanoff of Chicago, who's one of the great physicists of the 20th century and 21st, still superhero, a lot of stuff on scaling, and we've talked about universality. This was in celebration of his birthday, right? So they, okay, I don't know, I don't think there's sound. Sure, there's not sound, is it? Okay, I'll show you a little bit. I can't show you all of it, probably. It goes for 10 minutes. And there was, apart from losing all of the code, which is difficult, there was just also like, how do you publish this? And I think maybe it might be easier today. So I had a lot of fun with that. There you go. Bruce works a lot on earthquakes. Marcel, you can look at his stuff. He's in earth sciences, and Marcello's in biophysics and a lot of stuff with bird song, and hearing, and lots of other things. Okay, so this is real. I may have to jump a little bit to different places. You will go to sleep. You see they had a lot of fun with this. I mean, this is like killing a machine in whenever this was, 2000 maybe. This is great. Okay, keep going.
Are they simulating the creation of anything?
So this is real data. It should pan out, and I should explain what they're doing. There should be I guess I could, you know what? Oh, is there a little, what's the little speedy thing? I could do that, actually. I should speed up. So that was real data, actually, at the time, right? So it was, of course, so this is satellite data. It's pretty, it's really cool. Well, there were two different, there's LiDAR as well, where a plane flies across and gets a so-called digital elevation model, DEMs. So, is it all right? So, it's really hard, if you come in with differential equations, it's a really hard problem to think about. I mean, it's fluids, so we have the Navier-Stokes equations. We got them in a box, here it is, right? And then it's dirt and soil and rocks. I mean, it's a really nasty problem to try and deal with analytically. So this is, looks networkish. Lots of 2D kinds of simulations where you're flowing stuff down a plane. We'll talk about that. Okay, this is good. It's a carpet, basically. That's it. So that doesn't look like the Grand Canyon. That is basically a doormat. Yeah, but it produced those networks. If you flowed stuff through it, it produced those networks. It bounces. Yes.
What was this again?
2000 maybe. Yeah, so they become infinitely deep. So you have to have diffusion, so this is natural. So the geomorphologists will talk about, some of them will talk about bioturpidation, which is gophers and stuff. And there are organisms out there pushing dirt around and so on. There's also just the wind and all sorts of things that are smoothing out hilltops. So you should get this, definitely. You should get those. So diffusion, right? Stuff just falls down hills. So that's going to smooth out the tops of these things. It's starting to look better. Little cutting. I don't know where to jump. I don't want to jump on it too much. Come on, people. All right, let's jump a little bit. All right. YouTube, supply the data. Come on. Right. You know, this is well known, right? Right. So geomorphology, right? So that's the what's happening on the surface. So the geologists think this is ridiculous because it's just like a little bit of stuff on the top. I mean, it's just like, yeah, nonsense. But it's very important to us. We live on that bit. So, but the geological stuff produces, lifts mountains up and this sort of stuff. Right? So it produces these structures that, stuff like rain and avalanches, of course. Come on. Yeah. Right. So I'll show you the last part. Okay, so what they did is they put a sine wave in and then let it erode on top of that. So you imagine a river going through it. This is pretty cool. But here's a hard thing. It starts to look good. So what do you measure about this to say this looks like the real world? How do you measure? And we'll talk about characteristics of networks that we can quantify and that are connected to each other. Right there, come up with 20, 30 different things, but you might be able to say, well, 3 of these are independent. The rest all are connected. It's actually the history of this. Is people keep coming up with different measures, and eventually someone says, oh, yeah, these 3 things are the same as these 4 things. Okay. So they do different kinds of cutting and all sorts of stuff. What's that? Oh, yeah. Yeah, and it's got different angles on each side. So you can see you're not even getting river network type stuff on that side. Yeah, because there's a different angle. Come on. Well, so this stuff is the real world. This is real. So the stuff they start and finish with is real. But the other one, this is all simulation. Yeah, so this is all simulation. So I think that's probably a good place to stop. So we'll tackle this problem of what do you measure about this thing that might help you, see that it's similar to the real world, claim that it's the real world. Dynamics are a big problem, right? You have the river network, you have the Mississippi. What was it like 10,000 years ago, 100,000 years ago, a million years ago? We don't have the evolution so much, so you have to do some clever things there potentially. Anyway, but lots of good stuff. Turns out that all of this stuff will work for blood networks. And as I said, we'll get into supply stuff as well later on, where it's not one point going to many, it's many points going to many. Right? We're redistributing things. So what do those networks look like? Very good. Thank you.